I walked through my own front door and felt like a stranger. Not because the house had changed, not because the furniture was different or the walls were a new color. No, it was something quieter than that, something I couldn't name right away. The kind of feeling that settles into your chest before your mind catches up, before your brain decides to ask the question your body already knows the answer to. I stood in the entryway of the home I had lived in for 31 years. My boots were still muddy from the driveway. My bag was still on my shoulder. And I looked around that living room, that familiar, ordinary 31-year living room, and I noticed something. There was not a single photograph of me anywhere. Not one. I had been gone for 3 years, 3 years of service, 3 years of letters and phone calls and care packages and prayers, 3 years of promising I would come home, and I had come home. But somewhere between the day I left and the day I walked back through that door, my husband had quietly, carefully, completely removed me from the story of his life. I just didn't know it yet. My name is Margaret. Most people call me Maggie. My husband called me that for 40 years. Maggie. The way he said it was soft, like it cost him something to let it go, like my name was something precious he kept inside his mouth before he gave it to the air. I was born in a small town in rural Ohio. The kind of town where everyone waves whether they know you or not, where the diners close by 9 and the churches open early, where the sound of crickets at night is so loud you forget that silence exists. I grew up the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. Practical people, good people, people who taught me that showing up was the most important thing a person could do. I joined the army when I was 22 years old. It was 1981. People didn't know what to do with a woman in uniform back then. They smiled at you in a way that wasn't quite a smile. They said things that weren't quite compliments. But I kept my head down and I kept doing my job, and slowly, very slowly, the uniform started to feel like mine, not borrowed, not temporary, mine. I met Daniel the year I turned 25. He was a civilian contractor, tall, quiet, the kind of man who listened before he spoke, which was rare. He had brown eyes that went darker in low light, and he had this habit of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking, just slightly, like he was trying to hear something from a different angle. I loved that about him. I loved the way he took things seriously. We married in the spring of 1985. I wore my uniform. He cried. I didn't, not because I wasn't moved. I was deeply, quietly moved. But I had spent years training myself to hold emotion inward, and even on the happiest day of my life, I couldn't fully unlearn that. We bought the house on Clover Street the following year. A small brick house with a porch and a yard and a maple tree out front that turned the most extraordinary red every October. We raised 2 children there, our son Thomas and our daughter Claire. We had years of birthdays and holidays and school plays and Sunday dinners and arguments and reconciliations and quiet evenings where we sat together and said nothing and didn't need to. I continued my service throughout. There were deployments, there were long absences, but I always came home. That was the agreement we had, unspoken but understood. No matter where I went, I always came home. Until the year I turned 62. That year I was given one more assignment, a long-term advisory role overseas. 3 years, they said, maybe less if things went well. I hesitated, more than I had ever hesitated before. Thomas was in his 30s by then, established, living 2 states away. Claire had her own family, her own life, her own beautiful chaos. And Daniel was 64, healthy, active, managing well. He told me to go. You've given your whole life to this, he said. Give them this last piece, come home when it's done. I believed him. I need you to understand that. I believed him completely. There was not a single note of warning in his voice. There was not a flicker of something hidden. He looked at me with those brown eyes, slightly darker in the kitchen light that evening, and he told me to go, and I went. I called every week, sometimes twice. The connection was not always good. There were weeks of silence that neither of us could control. But when we did speak, he seemed fine, tired sometimes, quieter than usual, but fine. I told myself that was normal. That age was settling on us both, that years of distance had worn certain grooves smooth, that we had simply become 2 people who communicated in fewer words. I told myself a lot of things. I came home on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The maple tree in the front yard had not yet turned. It was still green, just barely, with the first edges of color beginning to show. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. I remember thinking, good, I'm home before it turns. I hadn't seen it turn in 3 years. Daniel met me at the door. He hugged me. He held me. I felt his arms around me and I closed my eyes and breathed in the familiar smell of him, soap and something else, something warm and particular that I had no name for but had carried in my memory across oceans. For a moment, everything was right. Then we pulled apart, and his face was different. Not older, though he was older. Not tired, though he was tired. There was something behind his eyes, something careful and arranged, like a room that has been quickly tidied before a guest arrives. Something put away, something hidden. I didn't name it in that moment. I filed it away in that quiet place in my mind where I put things I'm not ready to examine. I walked inside. That was when I felt it, that strange, heavy, wordless feeling. I walked through the entryway into the living room and I looked at the walls and the shelves and the mantel above the fireplace, and I understood something without understanding it. The photographs were different. Not all gone, but different. There were pictures of Thomas and his wife, pictures of Claire with her children, pictures of Daniel at various ages with friends with the kids at holidays. The wedding photo was still there, but it was smaller than I remembered, moved to a corner of the mantel, partially behind a vase of dried flowers. And the photos of me were gone. The one from my promotion ceremony in 1998. Gone. The one of the two of us at the Grand Canyon in 2007, one of the last real vacations we ever took, gone. The framed print of the unit photo from my second deployment, the one I had been so proud of, the one I had asked him personally to hang, gone. I stood there with my bag still on my shoulder, and I didn't say anything. Daniel was in the kitchen, making noise, asking about my flight, asking if I was hungry. His voice came to me from around the corner as if from a great distance. I heard the words, but not their meaning. I was counting absences. I was standing in my own living room, counting the spaces where I used to be. I put my bag down. I walked into the kitchen. I smiled at my husband and I said, I'm just going to wash up. And I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of our bed and I pressed both hands flat against the comforter. A new comforter, I noticed, one I had never seen before, and I sat very still and I listened to the sound of the house. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet. But I knew the first week home was careful. We moved around each other gently, the way people do when they are relearning the geography of a shared space. I noticed things. I cataloged them quietly, the way I had been trained to do. Small things. The kind of things that individually mean nothing but together begin to form a shape. His phone, which he used to leave on the kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket. The second bedroom, what we used to call the guest room, was locked. A simple push-button lock, but locked nonetheless. I tried the handle once and said nothing. His email was open on the laptop one morning, and he shut it quickly when I came into the room. Quickly and with a specific kind of casualness that isn't casual at all. The kind that's been practiced. He called me Margaret twice. He never called me Margaret. In 40 years he had called me Maggie, always Maggie. Margaret was what my mother called me when I was in trouble. Margaret was formal. Margaret was distant. Margaret was what you called someone you were not entirely sure of. He called me Margaret twice in 7 days, and each time he didn't seem to notice, and each time something shifted slightly in my chest, like a small stone rolling somewhere it shouldn't. I called Claire. She was happy to hear from me, warm and cheerful and full of stories about the grandchildren, my grandchildren, whom I had missed enormously and would be seeing soon, she promised. But there was something in her voice too, a slight elevation of brightness. The way people sound when they are being specifically, deliberately upbeat. I had a daughter who sounded like she was managing me. I called Thomas. Thomas was briefer. Thomas was always brief, even in the best of times. That was his nature, tight and contained like his father. But this was different. He asked about my flight. he asked about my health. He did not ask about the house or his father or how things were settling. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have been told not to say too much. I sat with all of this. I am not a person who panics. I am not a person who spirals. I have stood in situations of genuine danger and kept my breathing steady and my mind clear because that is what training does. It teaches you that clarity is more useful than fear. So I did not panic. I did not confront. I observed. I waited. I let the pieces arrange themselves. And slowly, very slowly, they began to. It started with the mail. Or rather, the absence of it. In 31 years on Clover Street, I had always received mail. Bills, yes, but also subscriptions, veteran benefits, correspondence, letters from old colleagues, cards. My name was on this house. My name was on our shared accounts, had been for decades. But in 2 weeks of coming downstairs to find Daniel already sorting through the day's mail, I had received exactly nothing addressed to me. I began to check things. I went to the bank website, the one we had used jointly for 20 years. I entered my login credentials. They didn't work. I tried again. Invalid. I requested a password reset. The system sent the confirmation to an email address I didn't recognize. Someone had changed it. I went to the file cabinet in the study. I remembered the file cabinet specifically, a gray metal 2-drawer unit we had bought at an office supply store in the late 90s. I had always kept copies of my important documents there. Service records, pension paperwork, the deed to the house. The cabinet was empty. Not reorganized, not moved, empty. I stood in front of that empty gray cabinet for a long time. The study was quiet around me. Afternoon light came through the single window at a low, amber angle. Dust moved in the light. And I stood there with my hands at my sides and I thought about what it means when a person's documents disappear. I had a colleague once, a woman I served with for a decade, who told me that the most effective form of erasure is paperwork. Not violence, not noise, paperwork. When someone removes your name from the records, when they redirect your mail and change your passwords and put your photos in a box in the attic, they are not destroying you loudly. They are dissolving you quietly, piece by piece, until there is nothing official left to prove you were there. I went to the attic. It was a Thursday evening. Daniel was downstairs watching television. I climbed the pull-down stairs carefully in the dark without turning on the light. I used my phone as a flashlight. The attic was not empty. There were boxes, 5 or 6 of them, brown cardboard sealed with tape. I opened the nearest one. My photographs, my framed commendations, a shadow box containing my medals, the Grand Canyon photo still in its frame, face down. A small ceramic cardinal that my mother had given me. It had sat on our windowsill for 25 years and I had assumed it was simply somewhere I hadn't looked. It had been packed away. All of it. Boxed and taped and placed in the attic as though I were someone who had died. I sat down on the attic floor in the dark with my phone light casting pale shadows across the boxes, and I held the framed Grand Canyon photograph in my hands. I looked at the two of us in it. Younger, laughing, standing at the edge of something enormous and beautiful, the wind in our hair, not knowing what was ahead. Daniel's arm around my shoulders. My face turned slightly toward him as if checking that he was still there. I set the photo down carefully. I went back downstairs. I cooked dinner. I said nothing. I found the folder by accident. Or maybe nothing is really by accident when you are paying attention to everything. It was a Sunday morning. Daniel had gone to the hardware store. I was straightening the bedroom, our bedroom, the room we shared, the room where I had slept for 31 years, and I pulled back the mattress to tuck in the fitted sheet more properly, and there was an envelope. A plain white envelope, unsealed, tucked between the mattress and the box spring. I stood there for a moment. I thought about putting it back. That was a real thought I had, a genuine moment of consideration. There is a version of myself that would have set that envelope back where I found it, smoothed the mattress over it, and continued living inside the comfortable uncertainty of not knowing. I considered that version. Then I opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails. About 20 pages folded in thirds. I unfolded them and sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. They were emails between Daniel and our son Thomas. The most recent was dated 8 months ago. The oldest was from about 2.5 years back, a little less than a year after I had deployed. I will not tell you everything that was in them. Some of it I am still not ready to name. But I will tell you the shape of it, the essential shape. Daniel had been for at least 2 years living as though we were no longer married. Not legally, he had not filed papers, had not officially done anything. But in every practical sense, our joint accounts had been restructured without my knowledge. He had spoken with an attorney, a family law attorney. I found that part later about the process of separation. He had described our marriage in these emails to my son as something that had been over for a long time. He had told Thomas. When I came home, he planned to have a conversation. He had referred to another woman. Not explicitly, not with guilt or drama, just a name mentioned in passing in context. A name I did not know, mentioned in the way that you mention someone who is simply present in your life. Margaret doesn't know about Sandra, he had written. We need to keep it that way until she's settled. I read that line several times. Margaret doesn't know about Sandra. I had been gone, I had been serving. I had been calling every week with a bad connection across thousands of miles, and he had been here in our house with Sandra's name in his emails and my photographs in boxes in the attic. I folded the papers, I put them back in the envelope, I put the envelope back where I found it, I straightened the mattress. I went downstairs, I started the coffee maker, I watched the dark liquid fill the pot and I breathed slowly and I did not make a sound. I was 64 years old. I had served this country for over 4 decades. I had survived things that would have undone other people. I had stood in uniform over the graves of colleagues and friends and said words and kept my face still and driven back to the base and done the next thing that needed doing. I was not going to fall apart over a white envelope on a Sunday morning. But something in me had shifted, something fundamental and permanent. The way a bone heals slightly differently after a break, still bone, still solid, but changed in its inner structure, in the precise geometry of what it had been. I was changed, he told me 3 days later. I hadn't prompted it, I had simply waited. I am good at waiting. And whatever he saw in me during those 3 days, some absence of my usual warmth perhaps, some careful stillness where there used to be ease, I think it told him that the time had passed. We were sitting at the kitchen table. It was evening. The light above the table was on and the rest of the kitchen was dim, and outside the window the maple tree had begun to turn. I could see the first red edges of it in the last of the daylight. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "Maggie?" He said it the old way, soft, like it cost him something. And for a single terrible moment I almost asked him not to say what came next, because I knew what came next and I knew that hearing it spoken aloud would make it different, more real, more permanent. But I said nothing. I sat with my hands in my lap and I waited. He said he had things he needed to tell me. He said he was sorry for the timing. He said that he had not meant for things to happen the way they had. He told me about Sandra. He said she was someone he had met 2 years ago. He said it had not been planned. He said, and I heard this particular sentence with a clarity I will never lose, he said, "I didn't think you were really coming back. I didn't think you were really coming back." I had called every week. I had written letters. I had sent photographs of myself in that faraway place so he would know I was real, still his wife. Still the woman who had married him in the spring of 1985 in her uniform while he cried. He said he had been lonely. He said the house had felt empty. He said he had started to move on. I asked him one question, only one. I said, "When did you take my photographs off the walls?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the table. He said, "About a year ago, I think." A year ago. Not when I left, not last week. A year ago, while I was still calling every week, while I was still coming home. He had taken my face off his walls a year ago and continued answering the phone. I stood up. I said, "Thank you for telling me." I walked to the back porch and I stood outside in the cooling evening air and I looked at the yard, my yard, the yard I had mowed and planted and weeded and sat in on summer mornings, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not in pieces, not carefully managed, all of it at once, the whole enormous thing. The photographs in boxes, the empty file cabinet, the email that said Margaret doesn't know, the year he had spent here in this house deciding I was already gone. I felt it all. And then I breathed. The nights were the hardest. During the day I was functional. I moved through the house with purpose. I made phone calls. I began the process of understanding what had legally happened to our shared life, what had been changed, what had been moved, what required my attention. I was systematic. I was thorough. I had been trained to manage crisis, and I managed this one with the same discipline I had applied to every other crisis in 40 years of service. But at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were off and Daniel slept, in the guest room now, we had agreed on that without discussing it directly, the darkness had a different quality. I would lie in the bed with the new comforter on it, and I would look at the ceiling and I would think about time. GHT about all the times I had come home from previous deployments and walked through the door and seen my face on the walls. My face in our life. Evidence that I existed in this space, that I belonged here, that my presence had been kept and maintained in my absence by the person who had promised to do so. I thought about the last phone call before I boarded the plane to come home. He had said, "I'll see you soon." He had said it normally, warmly even, and I had hung up the phone and smiled and thought, 40 years. We have 40 years and we are still here. I thought about a morning in 2003. I had come home from a long deployment, 8 months, and Thomas was 12 and Claire was 9, and they had made a banner. A handmade paper banner that said "Welcome home, Mom" in uneven letters, the M slightly too large, the O a little lopsided. And Daniel had hung it in the entryway, and when I walked in they had all been standing there, all 3 of them, and the relief on their faces, I can still see it. That particular kind of relief that means, you came back, you actually came back, and now the part of us that was held in suspension can resume. I had always come back. I had always come back. And I lay in the dark with the new comforter and I thought, what do you do with a life that you built in good faith and then someone quietly disassembled while you were away? What do you do with 40 years of real things, real love, real history, real mornings and evenings and ordinary Tuesdays, when the person who shared them with you has decided to treat them as a prelude to something else? What do you do with that? I cried once in those early weeks. It was late past midnight, and I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, and the crying came without warning, the way it sometimes does when you have been holding something so tightly for so long that your grip simply fails. It was not a dramatic crying. It was a quiet, terrible, physical thing, the kind of crying that is less about sadness than about the body's need to release what the mind has been managing. I sat there in the kitchen light and I cried until I didn't, and then I washed my face and went back to bed. That was the only time. It was enough. There is a moment, I cannot tell you exactly when it came, because it didn't announce itself, when grief stops being a weight and becomes something else. Something different in density and texture. Something that still hurts but has a different quality to the hurt. Less like drowning and more like standing in cold water and knowing you can choose to walk out. I found that moment sometime in the 3rd week. I had driven downtown to see an attorney, not because anyone told me to, not because I had asked for advice. I had simply gotten in the car I still technically co-owned and driven to the office of an attorney whose name I had found in the phone directory and sat down across the desk from a woman who reminded me slightly of Claire, and I said, "I need to know where I stand." She told me. The news was not uncomplicated. There were things that had been moved, accounts that had been adjusted, but there were also things that could not be moved legally without my knowledge and consent, and those things had not been moved because he had either not gotten that far or had been more careful than I thought, or, and I considered this, because some part of him had not been willing to go all the way. Even in the act of erasing me, he had stopped short of the final act. I drove home with a different posture. I sat straighter behind the wheel. I felt the steering wheel under my hands and the road passing under the car and the particular quality of afternoon light in late October, amber and low and ancient feeling, and I thought, I have survived harder things than this. Not to minimize it, not to pretend it wasn't enormous. It was enormous. 40 years is not a small thing. The photographs in boxes in the attic were not a small thing. The email that said Margaret doesn't know was not a small thing. The specific cruelty of someone continuing to take your phone calls while they have already decided you are gone, that is not a small thing. But I was still here. I was 64 years old and I had short white hair and hands that had done things that mattered in places that were hard, and I had come home. I had come home, as I had always come home, to a life that I had built, and if that life now needed to be rebuilt differently, rebuilt without a person who had decided to subtract me from it, then I was more than capable of doing that work. I had been rebuilding myself my whole life. This was simply the latest version. I went to the attic. I opened the boxes. I carried my photographs downstairs one by one. I hung them back on the walls, every single one. The promotion ceremony, the unit photo, the Grand Canyon, both of us laughing at the edge of something enormous. I hung them all, and then I stood in the middle of the living room and I looked at the walls and I looked at myself looking back from 20 different moments in time, and I thought, there you are. There you have always been. Nobody gets to put you in a box. Daniel moved out in November. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no recrimination, no the kind of argument that leaves scorch marks. We had both lived too long and too hard for that. We sat down one more time at the kitchen table, and this time we were both quiet and we said the practical things. Who would take what? Who would handle which calls? The house, we agreed, would remain mine. My name was on the deed and had been for 31 years, and that was not something he had managed to change. And I think in the end he did not try, because even he understood that the house was mine in ways that went beyond paper. He left on a gray morning in early November. He loaded his things into a rented truck. He was careful and orderly. He did not take things that were mine. He left the way a person leaves when they are carrying their own shame, not aggressively, not defiantly, but quietly, with eyes that moved past you rather than at you. I stood on the porch and watched the truck go. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I expected grief, and there is always some when 40 years closes. There is always the particular ache of a story that ends before you thought the last chapter had been written. But underneath the grief was something else. Something that felt almost like the morning air, clean, cold, full of oxygen. I went back inside. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and I watched the maple tree, which had gone fully gold and red now, spectacular in the November gray, and I drank my coffee and I was quiet. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. I called my daughter. I had real conversations with Claire, real ones, without the careful cheerfulness, without the management. She cried. I held the phone and let her cry. She said she was sorry, that she had known something was wrong, that she hadn't known how to tell me. I told her that she wasn't responsible for her father's choices and that she was my daughter, and that nothing between her father and me changed that by a single degree. I called Thomas. That was harder. Thomas had known more. Thomas had been included more. I could see it in the emails, the pattern of what was shared with him, the implicit request for his silence. That conversation was long. It was not easy, but it happened and it was real, and we were still standing at the end of it. I went to see a therapist. This surprised me more than almost anything else I did in that period. I had spent 40 years in an institution that treated the acknowledgement of need as a weakness. But I sat down in an office with a small lamp and a potted plant and a woman with kind eyes, and I said, I need some help understanding what happened. Not to Daniel. I understand what happened to Daniel. I need help understanding what happened to me. That was important work. That work mattered. I planted things in the yard in the spring. I joined a veterans group in the city, women veterans, mostly in their 50s and 60s, women who understood the particular complexity of a life divided between service and home. I told my story in that group, not all at once, but in pieces over several weeks. And the women listened and they nodded, and some of them said, I know exactly what you mean. And there is something extraordinary about being known, not fixed, not rescued. Just known. I drove to see the grandchildren in April. Claire's youngest, who was 5 and had never really known me yet, climbed into my lap while I was sitting on the couch and pressed his face against my shoulder and went asleep. Just like that. No preamble, no negotiation. He just climbed into my lap and went to sleep, the way children do when they have decided that someone is safe. I held him for a very long time. I thought about the woman who had walked through her own front door and felt like a stranger, who had stood in her living room and counted the spaces where she used to be. I thought about the attic and the boxes and the white envelope between the mattress and the box spring. I thought about the email, about the year the photographs came down, about the phone calls I had made across thousands of miles to a man who had already decided to move on. I thought about all of it. And then I looked down at the sleeping weight of my grandson in my arms and I thought, I am still here. All of that happened and I am still here. Older, different, changed in my inner structure, but here. Here on Clover Street, in the house with the red maple tree out front. Here with my photographs on the walls where they belong. Here with my name on the deed and my medals in the shadow box and my history on the shelves, not packed away, not hidden, not dissolved, not erased. He thought he could erase me. He thought he could put me in a box in the attic and carry on without me as though I had never been there. As though 40 years were a draft of something, a rough version, something to be discarded when the final copy arrived. He was wrong. You cannot erase a woman like me. You can try, and I will admit, I will tell you honestly, late at night, in the way that I am telling you now, that there were moments in those first weeks when I almost believed it was possible. When I stood in front of the empty file cabinet or lay in the dark with the new comforter or held the Grand Canyon photo in the attic light and felt the strange, disorienting vertigo of someone who has been told by their own life that they are not real. But I am real. I was real the day I put on a uniform, and I was real every day I wore it, and I was real every time I came home, and I am real now. Sitting here in my kitchen on Clover Street, with the light on and the night outside and this story in my chest where it has been living all these months, waiting to be told. My name is Margaret. Most people call me Maggie. And I am still here,